Welcome to Capitol View on WSIU. I'm Jeff Williams sitting in this week as we take a look at what's making news around the state in Illinois politics. Well, the leader of the Customs and Border Patrol immigration enforcement effort, Midway Blitz, is back in Chicago. Governor J.B. Pritzker has signed a $1.5 billion mass transit funding package. We'll take a closer look at those stories and likely some more this week on Capitol View. And to help lead the discussion, Hannah Meisel, State House and Chicago reporter for Capitol News Illinois, and Iqbal, Capitol State House reporter for WBEZ and for our Illinois public radio stations. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having us.
So, as I mentioned, Greg Bovino, the commander of the immigration officers in Chicago, is back in Chicago, along with reported surge in immigration enforcements this week as Operation Midway Blitz appears to be gearing back up. I know, Mawa, you covered the governor this week. He had some, I guess, praise for how Illinoisans have handled this enforcement effort, as well as, I guess, maybe some words of caution on this next wave of enforcement.
Right. We, that there was an unrelated press conference that the governor had yesterday where he talked about how Gregory Bovino and federal agents are back in Chicago, and they came back yesterday morning. We have reporters who were in Little Village, which is a western neighborhood of Chicago, who saw Gregory Bovino and his agents detaining people. So it seemed like they started deploying as early as yesterday morning. Governor Pritzker says they were out there, the agents were wearing masks, they were riding around in unmarked vehicles. So it's a lot of what we saw in the first round of this Operation Midway Blitz, so to speak, where you had a lot of agents targeting people in neighborhoods, in the suburbs, and using like increasingly aggressive tactics, right? So it was putting people in chokeholds, or if it's car chases or shooting people or using chemical munitions against protesters. It's a lot of that. And that's something that Governor Pritzker was saying, I'm very proud of the way that people in the Chicagoland area and Illinois have used their cell phones and their whistles to stand up for each other and to also document what's happening. But it's certainly unclear. Pritzker was saying that we don't know how long they're going to stay. They also didn't tell us that they were arriving, right? Like before, we were under the impression that the Sun-Times had spoken with someone at Department of Homeland Security who had suggested that Bovino was thinking about returning to Chicago in March, and with 1,000 agents, presumably because it will be warmer at that point. So the fact that they're back now and for maybe a couple of days is not what we were expecting, but regardless, Pritzker was like, we just need to make sure that people are protesting peacefully and that they're documenting what's happening. And it's interesting, too, that later this week, it's the Illinois Accountability Commission, which is created by Pritzker, by the state, to essentially document people's real life stories. So they're going to have their first town hall meeting in Chicago. And I guess, there'll be opportunity for people to just come and speak on what their personal experiences have been dealing with federal agents or protesting federal agents. And specifically their focus is on their use of chemical munitions. So like pepper spray and some of these other weapons that these agents have been using.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, Anna.
It was just a few weeks ago, kind of led by a couple of things. One, that there had been pretty credible intelligence that Border Patrol wouldn't be back until the spring. But then also because the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals had cast some doubt on this preliminary injunction that a federal judge had put in place, limiting agents' use of so-called riot control weapons, including tear gas, including other uses of force, like chokeholds, like Mawa mentioned, that, the folks who had brought this major lawsuit in the first place decided to kind of just pull back and say, we would actually like the case dismissed. And so currently there's really not any protections for people. Now, there are maybe norms, and I think there are things that people had learned during the first 2 months of Operation Midway Blitz, starting in September through mid-November. But right now, for however long these Border Patrol agents stay, Currently, uh, there's not really any protections, like I said, like there had been under this judge's temporary restraining order, which was then converted into a preliminary injunction. Um, this is especially doing this right before the holidays. I think it maybe sends a message from Greg Brovino that like your any sort of false sense of safety that you had, we want to just remind you that that it was just an illusion. And people who were expecting to be, home for the holidays, among their family, grateful that they were not, anyone who was swept up in the 3,000 plus immigration arrests during those first 2 months this fall. They're not so safe.
With this Governor's Accountability Commission, is there a sense of what the governor hopes will happen? Obviously, they're tracking and correlating stories and things that have happened, but is there a more tangible long-term end goal for this commission, do you think?
I think with all commissions that the state puts on, it really depends on the personalities of people who are leading it. But I also want to note that during fall veto session, lawmakers did pass legislation that would, and the governor had signed last week, it would bar civil immigration arrests from being carried out in courts, daycare centers, in hospitals, public universities, especially daycare centers. We had a case close to the end of the first surge of this woman who was, basically followed into her job at a daycare center in Chicago. Civil arrest in courts, that is actually quite common, especially if someone has an immigration court date. That has happened a lot. This being a state law, it is limited in its impact, but it also gives people, kind of a right to sue agents accused of violating their civil rights. Again, being a state law, it is limited, but I think the governor and state lawmakers, Democratic lawmakers, wanted to send a message. And this commission, I'll be very interested to see what results from it. At the very least, there will be, a narrative of, people who have experienced, being roughed up by these agents. Certainly we've heard many stories about actual U.S. citizens being detained and then maybe eventually let go, maybe even being taken all the way to the Broadview ICE processing center. But I like all state commissions, it's just very limited in scope because again, this is all under everything that federal immigration agents are doing is under federal law, and the state can only really do so much.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and going off of like what Hannah was saying, oh sorry, yeah, just going off of what Hannah was saying too, that this was something that when the lawmakers were considering through or passing it through the legislature and veto session, a lot of Republican lawmakers had said, like our main concern is that if you're going to give people the right to sue federal agents because they feel like their constitutional rights have been violated, whether that's because the agent refused to identify themselves or they were driving an unmarked vehicle or the plates of that vehicle were tampered with or whatever the case may be, well, can you actually do that legally, right? Like you can sue this agent in state court, which is what the state law carves out for people. But then who's to say that case won't get just kicked up to the federal court system? Or who's to say that, the federal government itself won't step in as like a defendant instead of this individual federal agent. So there's definitely a lot of legal questions, but the vibe or the sense I got from the Democrats, like Senate President Don Harmon, who carried this bill, and then Governor Pritzker, who signed it, is that we just want to give people something like a recourse. And we'll just see how it goes, I guess. But certainly with this commission, I would also, yeah, like Hannah said, I'd be curious to see like what they actually do with all these public accounts. And the website did say too, you can submit documents and photos to just to have a record of what people are experiencing.
And we'll continue to monitor and see what happens with that. Also this week, the governor signed the transit bill that essentially provides a $1.5 billion bailout for Chicago area public transit. It also provides a small amount of money for downstate transit. The majority of the funding comes from, I believe, diverting sales tax revenue from the motor fuel tax fund, as well as the diversion of some other incomes from the state road fund. Mala, help unpack what all is included in this transit funding package.
Yeah, essentially this transit bill, it can be split up into two components. One component is the governing aspect, which when talking to lawmakers, it seems like the governing aspect, so like how this new Northern Illinois, Chicagoland area transit body will operate, that seemed to be the more easier problem to address and solve. I talked with State Representative Evadina Delgado, who was pushing this measure through the House. And she was saying that, like we got the governing portion figured out with all the stakeholders, all the labor people, all the transit workers, all figured out immediately, right? And essentially what it is, it's replacing the regional transit authority. So they've created this new giant mega agency called NITA, Northern Illinois Transit Agency, or Authority, I'm sorry. But NITA will basically oversee Metra, PACE, Chicago Transit, and essentially the idea is to streamline fares for people. So like if you're someone who has to take the Metra, then you have to take the CTA subway, then you have to take, so then now under this new law, you can just get a fare that will carry on through the different transit services you may have to use in one go. It also, the idea is to streamline just scheduling and helping people figure out, like how to use these systems. But that was like probably one component. The other component that was probably the more difficult component to figure out for lawmakers was funding, right? So like you were mentioning too, they come up with all these different revenue streams because transit, and specifically in the Chicagoland area, was facing a pretty steep fiscal cliff. The original numbers that the Regional Transit Authority had come out with was like a $700 million fiscal cliff. They came out recently, like a couple months ago, saying that fiscal cliff has now shrunk to $200 million, but still a lot of money, right? And a bunch of, the labor advocates, labor union representatives are saying that with the fiscal cliff this large, that will mean cutting services. That might also mean laying off transit workers. And, this really has come about because a lot of the COVID recovery dollars that went towards Chicagoland Transit have since run out. So lawmakers were pretty hard pressed this past spring session and this past veto session to figuring out like how are we going to make sure that we have funding not just to meet this cliff, but also sustainable for years to come. And what they've come up with is a $1.5 billion annual revenue fund that would basically come from increasing toll fees. So in the Chicagoland area, the toll fee is going to go up 45 cents per car. It will also allow the transit authority to increase the local sales tax for the Cook and the Collier counties by 25% or 0.25%. So a quarter of 1%. And then, it also diverts funds from the motor fuel gas tax and then also from the road fund. And that's actually something that a lot of Republican lawmakers, and particularly downstate lawmakers, so you have House Minority Leader Tony McComey, you have Senate Minority Leader John Curran, who came out with their statements after Pritzker signed this law yesterday or earlier this week, saying that this is just going to hurt people in the suburbs. They're going to have to pay more in tolls and in the sales tax, but also it's going to hurt downstate. You're diverting these funds from downstate projects like infrastructure projects, bridges and roads and stuff. So it definitely, the sense I got from just talking to lawmakers is that the funding aspect specifically was going to be really difficult. not everyone's going to be happy with it. And certainly that's what ended up happening too, is that
Yeah.
you have people who are not happy with it. But you also have labor leaders who, that Tim Dre with the Illinois AFL-CIO, with the big labor union in Illinois, was at the press conference with Governor Pritzker to sign this law. And he was like, I could breathe a sigh of relief that we finally got this figured out. So.
Yeah. I know there's a lot of the downstate, and I'm saying Southern Illinois Republicans obviously got the message and spoke out against this funding mechanism. And there are a lot of road and bridge projects down in this part of the state. Was there any type of a fiscal note or a budget note on this legislation looking at the potential impact of utilizing the motor fuel tax and the state road funds to help fund this, and what in terms of what it might mean for future and ongoing construction and infrastructure projects?
Yeah, I think the idea was that, the funding for the infrastructure projects would come from different buckets, right? But that this motor fuel tax and then the road fund diversions will specifically be for transit, because that seemed to be the more pressing issue. It's again, it certainly, became a pretty heated, I guess, issue that for a lot of, like you said, downstate lawmakers too, who were talking about, that this is just another bailout for Chicagoland, where downstate's having to pay for a problem that Chicago needs help with. It seems to be like a recurring issue that keeps coming up in the legislature.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is the message that is heard over and over and over again. But and it certainly can feel unfair. I'm not discounting that, but research from Southern Illinois University has consistently found that contrary to that that feeling, it's really the Chicagoland area that supports economically the rest of the state. And letting transit fail, that is, for a lot of lawmakers, even Republicans in the suburbs, and remind people that the suburbs used to be a bastion of Republican policymakers. Letting transit fail was not an option, because transit represents so much economic opportunity, because you have to have people get to work every day. Of course, COVID disrupted people's transit patterns. COVID brought a lot of service disruptions too. One, because there was just not as much demand for it, especially during the height of the pandemic, but also, because people, office workers in Chicago who prior to 2020 would have gone downtown every single day, maybe they're commuting only 3 times a week now, or their work has turned into a fully remote job. But even still, you have to have that reliability of a public good. And I know that people pointed to the what happened in Philadelphia this past year, when they had their own fiscal cliff with their SEPTA system. And they didn't really solve that in time. And Philadelphia saw major service cuts, and that translates into economic depression. And it's a really, really difficult issue. I'm definitely not discounting that. And but the motor fuel tax, for example, that is something that can be used for transit projects. And the interest from the road fund, that's something that's been building, that'll provide a top off from what will be earned. And it's definitely not going to be pleasant to pay even more in tolls. I pay tolls up here all the time. And I get a little notification on my phone that iPass has taken another $20 out of my account. And it seems like not too long ago, I feel like there was a doubling in tolls. It used to be 40 cents, now it's 80 cents or something like that. And it's going to be, more than $1 now to go through certain tolls. That is hard to take. But at the end of the day, policymakers felt like transit is just something that could not fail. And there's, I think, larger economic, you know, there's a larger story that needs to be told, and there's a larger trend that needs to be addressed. But, on a state level, you can only do so much because a lot of uh, power to fix transit and to fund transit actually comes from the federal government. And as we know, the federal government is not into spending a lot of money right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Wanted to an issue wanted to touch on. We've had kind of an update as we're getting into the campaign season and jockeying for upcoming primary positions as well underway in the state for state lawmakers, including Senator Emil Jones III, who recently entered into a deferred prosecution agreement after his federal bribery trial ended in a mistrial. Jones was removed from his leadership position back in 2022 after indictment, and he's now facing a primary challenge. Hannah, you've been covering this case as it has unfolded. What does this latest development mean for the senator and also for his future in the General Assembly?
Yeah, this was a surprise. Myself and my colleagues were gearing up to cover his retrial in January, after having covered his 3-week trial in April, which, as you said, ended in a deadlock jury. And so in a hearing last week, it's a surprise that Emil Jones entered into this deferred prosecution agreement. But in another sense, I don't think it's actually that much of a surprise. I think watching that 3-week trial, there are certainly deficiencies in the government's case. And, of course, when everyone was called back into the courtroom in June, prosecutors said, yes, we're going to do a retrial. We're going to call some more witnesses. But I think ultimately that was maybe more to save face. And they knew that putting on a retrial might be kind of a waste of resources, especially now, given, how strapped the U.S. Attorney's Office is in Chicago and frankly around the country. There's been, massive, massive turnover of prosecutors and other folks who work in these U.S. Attorney's Office during the Trump administration, and there's been a turn of focus. Basically, to remind viewers, Emil Jones was accused of bribery. He was accused of agreeing to accept bribes, one in the form of $5,000 campaign contribution, which actually never came to fruition, and another, which was his idea, a job for his former intern. And the bribes were from this man named Omar Mani, who was an executive of this red light camera company called SafeSpeed. But unbeknownst to Emil Jones, he was actually working with the FBI. He had an undercover camera at 3 of their dinners in 2019. And then when the FBI came knocking in September of 2019, Emil Jones, he, lied to FBI agents saying that he didn't know that, what his former intern was getting paid for this kind of fake job that he only ended up having for about 6 weeks. But, again, there was a lot of deficiencies in the government's case, including and especially the fact that the $5,000 campaign contribution never came to fruition. And because, the bill that Omar Mani was trying to kill, which would have, kind of hurt the red light camera industry in his estimation. It didn't ever come up for a vote, but that's not because of Omar Mani's promised campaign contribution or the job for the intern. It's because Emil Jones was not just, he was not the most effective legislator, pushing that bill.
Right. In a couple of minutes,
I'm sorry. And like you said, he is facing primary challenge, and part of the, his time on the witness stand, which was also, a high risk, high reward kind of situation when he got on the witness stand. He said, yeah, I've never had a election challenge. And the prosecutor asked, then why do you have a campaign fund? Which is kind of a silly question for anyone who watches politics, because you have to have a campaign fund. But yes, he does have two primary challengers and apparently a Republican challenger, but I don't see any reason why he would really have to worry about these primary challenges. They're not really they're, not big names at all, and they're not really raising that much money. I think that um, the strength of his name, especially his father being former Illinois Senate President Emil Jones Jr., and the length of his tenure already. He's served since 2008 or 2009 after replacing his father on the ballot in 2008. Even with this blip, I think that he still wins.
All right. Well, Hannah, I'll let you have the last word. We are, once again, out of time. Hannah Meisel, Capital News, Illinois, Mama Iqbal, WBEZ. Thank you both for joining us this week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in to Capitol View. I'm Jeff Williams, and on behalf of everyone here at WSIU, we hope you have a happy and safe holiday season.